He took the arrows to save the Apache woman. And not for a moment did he regret the sun had just begun its climb over the jagged mountains of the southwest, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. The desert, though beautiful, was harsh and unyielding. Every rock, every crevice seemed to hold a story, a secret, or a danger. The wind whispered through the canyons, carrying with it the faint scent of sagebrush and dust. In this unforgiving land, survival was not given. It had to be earned day by day. Ethan Calloway moved quietly along a narrow path that wound through a rocky canyon. He was a young frontiersman, lean and strong with eyes that had learned to read the land as if it were a book. He knew which rocks could hide water, which plants were safe to eat, and how to listen to the wind to understand what it carried. Ethan had grown up on the frontier, the son of a trapper and a healer. From a young age, he had learned that life in this land demanded alertness, courage, and sometimes tough decisions. On this morning! Ethan's mission was simple. He needed to scout the land for water and food. Supplies had been running low, and the journey back to the settlement would take another day or two. He moved carefully, stepping lightly on the uneven stones, his eyes scanning every shadow and movement. The desert was alive in its own way, a flutter of wings, the scurry of a lizard, even the distant cry of a coyote could mean something. Ethan was always alert, always watching, always thinking. As he rounded a bend in the canyon, something unusual caught his eye. In the distance, a small cloud of dust was rising above the sand. At first he thought it might be a herd of deer or a wild horse, but as he focused he realized it was something else entirely. Moving quickly through the dust were three figures on horseback. Their movements were fast and purposeful, and Ethan's trained eyes noticed the weapons they carried. They were Apache warriors, their expressions fierce and determined. But they were chasing someone. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he saw a young woman running ahead of them. She was small and agile, darting between rocks and crevices, but she was clearly struggling to stay ahead. Her clothes were simple, practical, and torn in places from the harsh terrain. Her long dark hair whipped around her face, and her eyes were wide with fear. She moved with speed and desperation, but every now and then she stumbled, and the warriors closed the distance. Ethan froze. He could not leave her to face such danger alone. Something in him, honor, instinct, or perhaps just the refusal to let injustice go unchallenged, urged him to act. He weighed the options quickly. There were three warriors, armed and skilled, and he had only his rifle, a knife, and his wits. Engaging them could mean certain death. But watching the young woman suffer, knowing he could help, left him no choice. Courage, Ethan knew, was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. He slipped behind a large boulder that offered some cover and watched the scene unfold. The woman, whom he would later learn was called Nokomis, darted from one side of the canyon to the other, using every trick she knew to avoid capture. Ethan noticed how careful she was, how she avoided loose rocks and deep crevices, and how she tried to stay silent despite her exhaustion. It was clear she had survived many such chases before, but today she was not fast enough. One of the warriors was gaining on her, raising a bow with deadly precision. Ethan made his decision. He would have to draw the warrior's attention to himself, and in doing so, put his own life in danger. He stepped out from behind the boulder and shouted, his voice carrying across the canyon. "Hey! Over here!" The warriors froze for a moment, startled by the sudden presence of someone else. Ethan raised his rifle, though he did not intend to shoot immediately. He waved, moving into the open, making himself a clear target. The wind carried the sound of his voice, and the dust swirled around his boots. The young woman Nokomis glanced back, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting moment. There was a mix of confusion, hope, and fear in her gaze. Ethan gave her a nod, a silent message that she should keep running. The warriors reacted instantly, shouting and drawing their weapons.
Ethan felt the first arrow slice through the air, missing him by inches.
His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline flooding his veins. He dove behind another rock, rolling as he avoided a second arrow that struck the ground where he had been standing moments before. Each movement had to be precise, each decision critical. One mistake could end his life, and yet, in his mind, saving Nokomis was worth every risk. He could hear her footsteps echoing against the canyon walls as she ran, struggling to keep up her pace. Ethan realized that she was exhausted and the desert would soon take its toll on her. He had to buy her time, slow down the warriors, and keep them focused on him. With that thought, he leaped from his cover, firing his rifle, not to kill, but to scare and distract. The sound rang through the canyon, and the warriors faltered, glancing toward him instead of the fleeing woman. Arrows continued to fly, some narrowly missing, others grazing his arms and shoulders. Pain flared through him, but Ethan gritted his teeth and kept moving. Every wound was a reminder of the danger, but also a testament to the choice he had made. He was alive because he had decided to act, and though his body ached, his mind was clear. He could not stop now. Nokomis's life depended on it. The canyon twisted and turned, offering small advantages. Ethan used every rock, every shadow, and every dip in the land to maneuver. He knew the desert like the back of his hand, and he used that knowledge to stay just out of reach, drawing the warriors further away from the woman. Each moment he delayed them gave her precious seconds, maybe even minutes, to escape. Finally, after what felt like hours but was only minutes, Nokomis vanished from sight. Ethan risked a glance and saw her safely hidden behind a cluster of rocks. Relief washed over him, mingled with the pain from his injuries. He had done it. He had saved her. But the fight was not over. The warriors were still focused on him, and he knew the danger was far from gone. Ethan's mind raced as he planned his next moves. He needed to survive long enough for Nokomis to get away, and he needed to make sure the warriors did not simply return to hunt her down again. He ducked, rolled, and moved strategically, using every ounce of his strength and knowledge of the terrain. He could feel the heat of the sun on his back, the grit of the sand in his teeth, and the sting of his wounds, but he refused to stop. Each moment he reminded himself of the reason he had taken this risk, to save a life, to do what was right, no matter the cost. As the day progressed, the shadows lengthened across the canyon, and Ethan found brief moments of rest behind larger boulders. He could hear the warriors shouting in frustration, their voices echoing through the canyon. It was a dangerous dance, one of life and death, and Ethan had to stay sharp. Every breath, every heartbeat was a reminder that he was alone, outnumbered and exposed, but also alive, capable, and determined. In those quiet, tense moments, Ethan thought about the woman he had just saved. He wondered who she was, what her life had been like, and what fears she had faced. He realized that she was more than just a stranger. She was a person with a story, with hopes, with courage of her own. And somehow, in the middle of this harsh, unforgiving desert, a connection had formed between them. Not a spoken connection, not yet, but a bond forged in courage and trust. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long orange shadows across the canyon, Ethan prepared himself for the next stage of the encounter. The warriors were relentless, but so was he. And even though his body ached and his strength was fading, one thing was certain in his mind: he would not regret this choice. Saving Nokomis had been worth every risk, every arrow, every ounce of pain. He had made his decision, and he would stand by it no matter what came next. The desert around him was quiet now, except for the occasional sound of wind and distant calls of wildlife. But Ethan's heart remained alert, beating fast, alive with purpose. The story of courage, honor, and sacrifice had only just begun, and he was ready to see it through, one step at a time, in the unforgiving yet beautiful land that he called home. Ethan's heart was still pounding from the chase, but he knew that this was only the beginning. The desert was unforgiving, and the Apache warriors were skilled and relentless. He could hear their voices echoing through the canyon, filled with anger and determination. Each shout, each sound of hooves reminded him that the danger was far from over. Yet even with his body aching and arrows having grazed his arms and shoulders, he did not hesitate. Courage, he knew, was not a choice made once. It had to be renewed with every step, every breath. He ducked behind a jagged boulder, using it as cover while he assessed his situation. The warriors were approaching from the opposite side, their movements careful but steady. Ethan could see the glint of their weapons in the sunlight, the bows ready to strike, the eyes sharp and unyielding. He realized that he would need to be clever, using the land and his knowledge of it to his advantage. Every rock, every shadow, every turn in the canyon could become both a hiding place and a trap. From his vantage point, Ethan watched Nokomis disappear further into the rocks. Relief warmed him for only a moment before he reminded himself that she was still in danger. If he did not keep the warriors focused on him, she would not have a chance to escape completely. He inhaled deeply, feeling the sharp sting of the arrows in his arms, and prepared himself to move again. Pain was part of survival, part of the fight, but it could not stop him. Suddenly, an arrow whistled past his ear, landing in the dirt with a harsh thud. Ethan rolled to the side instinctively, narrowly avoiding what could have been a fatal strike. His mind raced as he considered his next move. He could not stay in one place for long. The canyon was a dangerous maze, but it was also a chance to outsmart the warriors. If he could lead them into the narrower passages, he might slow them down, giving Nokomis more time to find safety. He sprinted across the open ground, keeping low to avoid being an easy target. The sand and dust rose around his boots, swirling in the sunlight, and he felt the burn of exertion in his legs and lungs. One more glance at the warriors showed that they were splitting up, trying to flank him. Ethan knew that if they succeeded, he could be surrounded, but he refused to panic. Calmness, strategy, and quick thinking were as important as courage. He focused on the land, on the rocks and shadows that could give him an advantage. As he ran, he noticed a narrow path winding between two high cliffs. It was a risky move, but he calculated that it might be his best chance to control the chase. If he could force the warriors into this tight space, their numbers would count for less and their arrows would be harder to aim. He dove into the path, feeling the cool shade of the cliffs on his skin and the rough edges of rocks scraping his hands. His muscles screamed, but he pushed forward, using every ounce of his strength to maintain speed and balance. The warriors were close behind, shouting and firing arrows. Ethan felt the wind from a near-miss brush against his cheek. The sound of the arrows striking rock was deafening in the narrow canyon, bouncing back and echoing through the cliffs. He could feel the fear, but he did not allow it to dominate him. Fear was a tool, not a master. It sharpened his senses, made him move faster, and kept him alert. Then he heard it. A shout from Nokomis. She had stopped for a moment to catch her breath, and her voice, though quiet, carried across the rocks. Ethan paused for a brief instant, torn between the urge to go to her and the need to stay the warrior's focus. He reminded himself that if he left his position, the warriors would chase her instead. He had to act as a shield, even if it meant more arrows and more pain. The first arrow struck his shoulder this time, and he stumbled slightly, gritting his teeth against the sharp ache. Every wound made his movements more difficult, but he adapted. Rolling to the side, he grabbed a loose rock and threw it at one of the warriors. The rock hit its target, startling the man and causing him to lose focus for a moment. That brief hesitation was all Ethan needed. He kept moving, sprinting deeper into the canyon, forcing the warriors to follow him instead of searching for Nokomis. He began to notice signs of her progress. A footprint here, a brush bent there. She was moving carefully but steadily. Ethan allowed himself a small measure of satisfaction. She was surviving, and he was buying her the time she needed. It was a strange kind of partnership, this silent cooperation between two strangers. Neither had spoken more than a few words, but they were connected by courage, by the shared struggle for survival. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the canyon began to narrow even further. Ethan knew that he could not outrun the warriors indefinitely. The path was winding and treacherous, with sharp drops and loose stones. One wrong step could be fatal. But he also saw an opportunity. A ledge above him jutted out over the canyon, creating a natural barrier. If he could position himself there, he might gain the advantage of height, forcing the warriors to approach carefully and giving him the chance to defend himself more effectively. He climbed the rocks with careful, deliberate movements, feeling every scrape and cut on his arms. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body screaming for rest, but he pushed on. He reached the ledge just as the first warrior appeared at the bottom, looking up in surprise. Ethan raised his rifle and shouted, using his voice and position to intimidate them. "Back off!" he yelled. "Leave this canyon, or face the consequences!" The warriors hesitated, not expecting him to appear so suddenly above them. Ethan knew this was the moment to act, not with violence, but with courage and strategy. He aimed carefully, making sure they understood he was capable of defending himself without causing unnecessary harm. He needed to hold them here just long enough for Nokomis to gain more distance and eventually escape the canyon safely. Time seemed to stretch. Each second felt like a minute. Arrows whizzed past him, some striking the ledge near his feet, some embedding in the rock beside him. Ethan felt the sting of minor wounds, but he did not falter. His mind was entirely focused on the task: protect Nokomis, survive, and outwit the warriors. Every decision, every movement was deliberate, precise. He had trained for survival in the wilderness. But this was more than training. This was instinct, courage, and moral resolve, all combined. In the distance, he could see a figure moving carefully between rocks. Nokomis had found a safer path, away from the main trail of pursuit. A small surge of hope lifted Ethan's spirits. She would make it if he continued to hold the warrior's attention. Pain from his wounds was secondary now. The knowledge that he was making a difference, that his actions were saving a life, gave him strength beyond what his body should have allowed. Hours seemed to pass, though it was likely only minutes, as Ethan maintained his position on the ledge. The warriors, frustrated and cautious, began to retreat slightly, wary of his sudden appearance and calculated defense. Ethan used this moment to shift positions, staying unpredictable and keeping them uncertain. The desert, harsh and unyielding, had become both his challenge and his ally. He moved like water over rocks, blending courage with strategy, using the land itself to shield and protect. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the warriors began to pull back, their shouts fading as they retreated from the canyon. Ethan did not immediately relax. He knew that danger was never fully gone in this land, but for now, the immediate threat had lessened. He allowed himself a brief moment to look toward the path Nokomis had taken. Relief warmed him again. She was out of sight, moving toward safety. Ethan lowered himself from the ledge carefully, his body aching, his wounds burning, but his mind clear. The desert around him was quiet now, except for the whisper of wind and the distant calls of birds. He knew that the moment of danger was not entirely over, but he had succeeded in his purpose. He had protected her. At least, for now. Courage, he thought, was not about being fearless. It was about acting in spite of fear, and that he had done. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the canyon, Ethan allowed himself a small smile. He was battered, tired, and in pain, but he was alive. And more importantly, so was Nokomis. His actions had bought her time, given her a chance, and that knowledge filled him with a quiet, unwavering pride. Even as he rested behind a boulder, nursing his wounds, he knew that he would do it all again, without hesitation. There was no regret in courage, no regret in choosing to do what was right, no matter the danger. The desert stretched endlessly around him, harsh yet beautiful, silent yet alive. Ethan knew that his journey was far from over, but he also knew something deeper now. Bravery was not measured by fame or recognition, but by the choices one made when no one else was watching. And in that choice, he had discovered something profound about himself, about honor, and about the value of protecting life, even at great personal cost. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the jagged peaks of the canyon, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the rocky desert floor. Ethan Calloway leaned against a boulder, his body battered and aching from the arrows and the relentless chase. His breath came in uneven gasps, and the sharp pain in his shoulder and legs reminded him of every near miss. Still, despite the exhaustion, there was no hint of regret on his face. Every bruise, every cut, every arrow wound was a mark of a choice he had made, a choice to protect a life that was not his own. He could still hear faint shouts echoing in the distance. The Apache warriors had retreated for now, but he knew better than to believe the danger was gone completely. In the desert, threats could return without warning, and survival demanded constant vigilance. Ethan slowly scanned the canyon, his eyes sharp, his mind alert. Somewhere ahead, hidden among the rocks and shadows, was Nokomis, the young Apache woman he had risked everything to save. She had vanished from sight earlier, but he knew she was alive. That knowledge brought in both relief and renewed determination. Cautiously, Ethan moved from his hiding place, testing the ground ahead. Every step was deliberate, every movement measured. The desert could be treacherous, even without enemies. Loose rocks, hidden crevices, and sudden drops could turn a simple walk into a deadly fall. His body screamed in protest, his muscles stiff from exertion and fatigue, but his mind remained clear. He had to keep moving. Nokomis's safety depended on it. As he rounded a bend in the canyon, Ethan spotted a faint figure moving carefully among the rocks. It was Nokomis. She was crouched low, using the shadows for cover, her dark hair falling over her face. She froze when she noticed him, her eyes wide with surprise and something else, recognition, perhaps, or relief. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the small distance, both breathing heavily, both aware of the danger that still lingered nearby. Ethan raised a hand in a cautious greeting. "You're safe for now," he said quietly, careful not to draw attention. His voice, though soft, carried the weight of sincerity and reassurance. Nokomis hesitated, then nodded slightly, a faint smile appearing on her face. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. She understood that he had risked everything to help her, and for that, she felt a mixture of gratitude and respect. But there was no time for prolonged relief. Ethan could hear the distant sounds of movement, rocks shifting, the soft crunch of boots on gravel. The warriors were returning, determined to track them down. Ethan knew they would not give up easily and that Nokomis was still vulnerable. He gestured for her to follow him, and together they moved cautiously through the twisting canyon paths, keeping low and using the terrain to their advantage. As they walked, Ethan noticed that Nokomis was limping slightly, her small feet showing signs of strain. The desert had taken its toll on her, as it had on him. He paused, offering her water from a small leather pouch he carried. She accepted it silently, her dark eyes watching him carefully. In that quiet exchange, a bond began to form. One built not on words, but on shared struggle and mutual reliance. Each understood that the other had risked their life in this harsh, unforgiving place. The canyon opened into a wider area, dotted with large boulders and sparse vegetation. Ethan knew this would be a risky place to move through, but it was also necessary. The warriors could not follow easily without exposing themselves, and it would give them both a chance to rest and recover for a brief moment. He found a small sheltered spot behind a cluster of rocks and signaled for Nokomis to stay close. "Rest for a moment," he whispered, his voice low and steady. "We need to be ready if they come back." Nokomis sank to the ground, her dark eyes studying him with a mix of curiosity and wariness. Ethan noticed the tension in her posture, the way her hands flexed and tightened, ready to defend herself if needed. He understood. Trust had to be earned here, in a place where betrayal could mean death. He offered her a reassuring smile. "You're safe with me," he said simply. For the first time since the chase began, they had a moment of calm. Ethan used it to tend to his wounds as best as he could. The arrows had grazed his arms and shoulders, leaving shallow cuts that burned with every movement. He cleaned them with water from his pouch, wrapped them carefully with cloth, and applied a small salve he carried for emergencies. Nokomis watched him quietly, her eyes softening as she saw the care he took, not only for himself, but for her safety. After a few minutes, Ethan spoke again. "We can't stay here too long. They'll be back, and if they find us, it won't be good for either of us." Nokomis nodded, rising to her feet. She was stronger than she looked, despite her small frame. Her movements were careful but purposeful, and Ethan could see the determination in her eyes. She was no stranger to hardship, no stranger to danger. He had always known that, but seeing her now, in this quiet moment after the chaos, he felt a deep respect for her courage. They moved again, slowly and cautiously, navigating the rocky terrain with care. The canyon twists and turns created natural barriers, hiding them from view but also slowing their progress. Ethan led the way, using his knowledge of the land to find paths that would minimize risk. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. He could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on him, but he did not falter. The safety of Nokomis and the morality of his choice demanded focus and resolve. As they progressed, Ethan noticed small signs of life in the canyon. Lizards darting across the rocks, birds calling from above, and the faint rustle of desert plants in the wind. The desert was alive, and yet it was indifferent to their struggle. It gave no comfort, no help, only the raw challenge of survival. Ethan respected it. He knew that mastering this land required more than strength. It required patience, observation, and understanding. Hours passed slowly. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows and turning the sky into a canvas of oranges and purples. Ethan and Nokomis found a small cave-like shelter in the rocks, where they could hide and rest without being seen. Inside, the air was cooler, and the shadows provided cover from any prying eyes. Ethan helped Nokomis settle, offering her a small portion of dried food he carried. She ate quietly, her trust in him growing with every careful gesture. Why did you help me?" Nokomis asked finally, her voice soft, almost a whisper. Ethan looked at her, meeting her gaze steadily. "Because it was the right thing to do," he replied simply. "No one deserves to be hunted like that." "Death to the turncoat! No one deserves to face danger alone when there's a chance to help." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in her eyes. In that moment, a deeper understanding passed between them. It was not friendship yet, nor was it anything more than shared survival, but it was a connection born from courage, trust, and the choice to act selflessly in the face of danger. Night began to fall, and the temperature dropped sharply. The desert could be merciless in its cold after the heat of the day. Ethan gathered small pieces of wood and dry brush, carefully starting a small fire that would provide warmth without drawing too much attention. Nokomis watched silently, and for a brief moment they sat together in the quiet of the desert night. The firelight flickered across their faces, highlighting exhaustion, pain, and the faint glimmer of hope. As the night grew deeper, Ethan reflected on the events of the day. He thought of every arrow that had whizzed past him, every risk he had taken, every choice that had led to this moment. He felt the ache in his body, the fatigue in his limbs, but there was no regret. Courage, he realized, was not a matter of glory or recognition. It was a matter of action when it was needed most. He had acted, and a life had been saved. That was enough. Nokomis, lying nearby, seemed to sense his thoughts. She had faced many hardships in her life, but she had never encountered someone who would risk themselves so completely for her safety. She did not fully understand his motives, but she felt the truth of them. And in that feeling, a quiet trust began to take root, a bond that would carry them both through the challenges yet to come. The desert night was calm now, almost peaceful. Stars dotted the sky, shining above the rugged landscape, and the wind whispered gently through the rocks. Ethan and Nokomis remained close to the fire, their bodies tired but their spirits alive. Danger was not gone, but it was distant for the moment. In that quiet shared space, they found a fleeting sense of safety, and perhaps the beginnings of something more profound, a connection forged in courage, trust, and the will to survive. Ethan knew the path ahead would be difficult. The warriors might return. The desert would not be kind, and his wounds would need care. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of rest, a brief pause to gather strength. He had made choices that day that few others would have dared to make, and though pain and fatigue weighed heavily on him, he felt a quiet pride. He had acted with honor, with bravery, and with an unwavering commitment to protect another life, no matter the cost. As the fire crackled softly and the night deepened around them, Ethan and Nokomis drifted into a restless sleep. The canyon held its secrets, the desert whispered its stories, and the two strangers who had become allies lay side by side, united by courage, trust, and the unspoken understanding that their lives were now intertwined. The story of survival, bravery, and honor was far from over. But for this night, they had each other, and that was enough. The morning sun slowly climbed above the canyon, bathing the desert in soft light. Ethan awoke stiff and sore, the aches in his muscles and wounds reminding him of the arrows that had grazed him the day before. Each movement sent a sharp reminder through his body, but he did not allow the pain to overwhelm him. He had survived the worst of the chase, and for now, that was enough. The desert around him was quiet, the stillness broken only by the soft rustle of the wind through the rocks and the distant calls of birds awakening with the day. Nokomis was already awake, sitting nearby with her knees drawn to her chest. She watched him carefully, her dark eyes alert and thoughtful. For a moment, neither spoke. The night had given them both a brief respite. But the challenges were far from over. Ethan knew that he needed to rest and recover, but he also understood the importance of planning for what lay ahead. Their journey was far from finished, and every moment of hesitation could bring danger back to their path. "Are you hurt badly?" Nokomis asked finally, her voice calm but concerned. She had faced many hardships in her life, yet she spoke now with genuine care. Ethan shook his head, though a grimace crossed his face as he moved his shoulder. "I'll survive," he said quietly. "Some scratches, some aches, nothing I can't handle." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You risked yourself for me," she said softly. "I do not forget this." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. In the quiet honesty of the desert morning, Ethan felt the depth of her gratitude, and he realized that their bond was growing stronger. It was not yet friendship, but it was trust, and trust was far more valuable in this harsh land. After ensuring their immediate surroundings were safe, Ethan began to tend more carefully to his wounds. He tore strips of cloth from his own shirt, using them to bind shallow cuts and bruises. He applied a small amount of the salve he carried, designed to prevent infection and ease pain. Nokomis watched quietly, learning from his actions. In turn, she shared small pieces of knowledge about the desert, where water might be found, which plants were safe to eat, and how to read subtle signs in the rocks and sand. Ethan listened carefully, appreciating her wisdom and the practical understanding she had gained from living in this land. Despite the danger still lingering in the distance, they shared a quiet moment. Ethan offered Nokomis a small portion of his remaining food, and she accepted it with a polite nod. The desert was unforgiving, and even small gestures of care were meaningful. For Ethan, these moments were reminders of why he had chosen to act, why he had risked his life to protect someone else. It was not glory he sought, only the knowledge that he had done what was right. By midday, Ethan felt strong enough to move again. The canyon paths were narrow and treacherous, but they needed to find a safer route out. He led Nokomis carefully, using his knowledge of the land to avoid open areas where they could be seen. The desert was both beautiful and dangerous, with its rugged rocks, shifting sands, and sudden drops. Ethan moved steadily, mindful of every step, every crevice, and every shadow. As they traveled, Ethan asked Nokomis more about her life and her people. She spoke cautiously, not revealing too much at first, but over time, her words painted a picture of a culture rich with history, traditions, and resilience. She told him about her family, the challenges of surviving in the desert, and the values that guided her people. Ethan listened intently, gaining insight into a world very different from his own. In return, he shared pieces of his life as a frontiersman, the lessons he had learned from his father, and the experiences that had shaped him. Through their conversations, a quiet understanding began to grow between them. They were strangers brought together by circumstance, yet now they shared a mutual respect rooted in bravery, survival, and honor. Each had risked much, and each had gained a glimpse into the other's strength and character. The bond was subtle, not spoken of openly, but it was undeniable. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Ethan spotted a small oasis ahead. A cluster of rocks created a sheltered area with a trickle of water flowing through it, providing both hydration and a place to rest safely. He motioned for Nokomis to approach quietly. The sight of water brought a sense of relief and hope. They drank carefully, savoring the cool liquid, and washed their faces, feeling refreshed despite their exhaustion. The oasis offered a temporary refuge, a place where they could gather their strength before continuing their journey. While resting, Ethan reflected on the events of the past day. The arrows, the chase, the danger. It had all been a test of courage and determination. Yet he felt no regret. Every choice he had made, every risk he had taken had been necessary to save Nokomis. The physical pain was real, but the emotional weight of knowing he had protected another life was far more meaningful. He had acted without hesitation, guided by a sense of honor that would not allow him to stand by while someone else faced harm. Nokomis, sitting nearby, seemed to sense his thoughts. She had experienced danger many times, but she had never known someone willing to put themselves so completely at risk for her safety. The desert had shaped her into a survivor, but Ethan had shown her a different kind of strength, one rooted in courage, moral clarity, and selflessness. She did not fully understand the reasons behind his actions, but she felt their truth. Night fell once more, and the desert's temperature dropped sharply. Ethan built a small fire to keep warm, careful to keep it low and controlled so as not to draw attention. Nokomis gathered some dry brush, and together they maintained the fire. Around it, the shadows danced across the rocks, and the night air carried the quiet sounds of the desert, distant howls, the rustle of small animals, and the whisper of the wind. As they sat together by the fire, Ethan spoke softly. "We've made it this far because we've worked together," he said. "I couldn't have done it alone, and neither could you. Trust, that is what has kept us alive." Nokomis looked into the flames, then at him. "I trust you," she said slowly. Her words were simple, but in the desert, trust was rare and precious. Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her statement. Their bond was not based on familiarity or friendship alone. It was built on shared danger, shared courage, and the recognition of each other's strength. The fire burned low, and exhaustion eventually overtook them. Ethan rested his back against a boulder, letting the warmth soothe his aching muscles. Nokomis lay nearby, her eyes heavy with sleep. In that quiet night, surrounded by the harsh yet beautiful desert, both felt a rare sense of safety. They were far from free of danger, but they had each other, and that provided a measure of comfort and hope. In the early hours of the next day, Ethan awoke to the sound of soft movement. Nokomis was stirring, careful and alert even in sleep. He watched her for a moment, realizing how much courage she carried within her small frame. Survival in this land required more than skill. It required heart, determination, and the willingness to act despite fear. Nokomis possessed all of these qualities, and Ethan knew that together they could face whatever challenges remained. As the sun rose higher, Ethan began planning their next steps. The warriors could return, and the desert still held countless dangers. They would need to continue moving carefully, using the terrain to their advantage, and relying on both their skills and growing trust in each other. Every choice had to be deliberate, every movement intentional. Yet he also knew that they had survived so far because they had acted together, each supporting the other in moments of weakness and danger. In the days that followed, Ethan and Nokomis traveled cautiously through the canyon and surrounding desert. Ethan tended his wounds, and Nokomis shared more knowledge about the land. They foraged for food, found small sources of water, and learned to move with quiet precision. Each day was a balance of caution and courage, but with each step, their understanding of each other grew. Mutual respect blossomed alongside the necessity of survival, forming a quiet bond that neither could ignore. Ethan reflected often on the choices he had made. Saving Nokomis had required courage, strength, and risk, but it had also revealed something deeper within himself. He had discovered the true meaning of bravery, not in glory, not in recognition, but in the quiet certainty that one had done what was right, even at great personal cost. The desert was harsh, unyielding, and unforgiving, but it also offered clarity. Courage, honor, and moral conviction were what sustained life in such a place. Nokomis, too, reflected on the journey. She had been taught to survive, to move quickly, to trust few, but Ethan had shown her a new way, through action, through selflessness, and through unwavering moral strength. She began to see that bravery was not only about survival, but also about protecting others, about choosing to act in the face of fear. In the quiet moments between danger and necessity, both began to recognize that their shared journey was about more than reaching safety. It was about understanding courage, trust, and the value of human connection in a world that often demanded harsh choices. The sun had climbed high over the rugged desert once again, casting bright light on the rocks, sand, and sparse vegetation of the canyon. Ethan Calloway moved carefully along the narrow path, his body still sore from his previous wounds. Each step reminded him of the arrows he had taken, the pain that had accompanied every choice he had made to protect Nokomis. Yet, despite the aches and fatigue, there was no hint of regret in his eyes. Not for a single moment had he wished to act differently. Courage, he knew, had been more than a choice. It had been a necessity, and it had defined him in ways he could not yet fully understand. Nokomis followed closely behind, her small figure moving with cautious precision. She was stronger now, tempered by the trials of the past days. The desert had tested her, as it had tested Ethan, but each challenge had left them both wiser, more aware of themselves, and more connected to each other. Their bond had grown beyond mere survival. It was a quiet trust, forged in danger and sealed by courage. As they emerged from the narrow canyon into a more open desert plain, Ethan paused to scan the horizon. The vast land stretched endlessly, a mixture of sand, rocks, and distant mountains. He could see the faint traces of trails in the sand, signs that others had traveled here before. The desert was still, but he knew better than to believe that calm would last forever. Yet in this moment he allowed himself to feel a small sense of accomplishment. They had survived, they had endured, and they had done so together. "I think we can reach the settlement before nightfall," Ethan said quietly, his voice carrying across the still air. "We just need to keep moving carefully and avoid the open areas as much as possible." Nokomis nodded, her expression serious. "I will follow your lead," she replied. Her words were simple, yet they reflected her complete trust in him. For Ethan, this acknowledgement was more meaningful than any praise or reward. Trust, earned in the harshest of circumstances, was far more valuable than recognition from strangers. They moved steadily, navigating around jagged rocks and small cliffs, always keeping an eye on the distant horizon. The desert tested their endurance at every turn. Loose stones threatened to twist ankles, sudden drops could lead to serious injury, and the sun's heat pressed down relentlessly on their backs. Yet Ethan and Nokomis pressed on, careful but determined, each step a testament to their resilience and commitment to survival. As afternoon approached, Ethan noticed signs of life near a small cluster of trees, a rare oasis where water flowed slowly through a shallow pool. He approached cautiously, knowing that this might be their best opportunity to rest, replenish their strength, and tend to lingering injuries. Nokomis followed, her steps light but deliberate. Together, they drank from the water, letting the cool liquid refresh their bodies. Ethan carefully cleaned his wounds once more, ensuring they were protected from infection. Nokomis did the same, though her injuries had been fewer than his. In the quiet of the oasis, surrounded by the gentle rustle of leaves and the faint sounds of birds, they shared a moment of peace. The desert, which had seemed so harsh and unforgiving, had offered them a rare sanctuary. Ethan looked at Nokomis, studying her face as she drank from the water. He realized how much she had endured in so little time, and yet how resilient she had remained. The fear that had marked her eyes at the beginning of their journey was replaced now by determination and cautious hope. She had survived because of her courage and instincts, but also because of his intervention. And in turn, he had survived because he had acted, guided by honor and a moral certainty that would not allow him to stand by while another faced harm. The desert sky began to deepen in color, shifting to shades of orange, pink, and violet. Evening was approaching, and they needed to make their next move before darkness fell. Ethan plotted a careful route toward the distant settlement, keeping to paths that offered natural cover and avoided exposure. The shadows lengthened, but their resolve remained strong. Every movement was calculated, every choice deliberate, reflecting the lessons they had learned over the past days. As they continued, Ethan spoke quietly. "You've been brave," he said. "Not just in running from danger, but in trusting someone you barely know. That courage is rare." Nokomis looked at him, a faint smile playing on her lips. "And you risked your life for me. That is also courage." Her words were simple, yet they carried deep meaning. Ethan nodded, appreciating the honesty in her voice. There was no need for embellishment or exaggeration. The truth of their actions spoke louder than any words could. Hours passed, and the settlement finally came into view. Smoke rose from chimneys and faint voices carried across the plains. Ethan allowed himself a moment of relief. Their journey through the desert filled with danger, hardship, and endurance was nearing its conclusion. Yet he knew that the trials had changed them both. They were no longer simply two strangers caught in circumstance. They were allies, bound by shared experience, trust, and respect. As they approached the settlement, villagers noticed their weary forms and rushed forward to offer assistance. Ethan and Nokomis were led to a shaded area, given food, water, and medical attention for their wounds. Ethan allowed himself a brief rest, feeling the warmth of gratitude and relief wash over him. Nokomis sat nearby, quietly observing the activity around them, yet clearly comforted by their arrival in safety. Ethan's injuries were treated by a skilled healer who marveled at the resilience of his body despite the arrow wounds and fatigue. As the healer worked, Ethan reflected on the journey, the fear, the pain, the courage, and the choices he had made. Not for a single moment had he regretted acting. Every step, every risk, every decision had been necessary, and in saving a life, he had found a sense of purpose that went beyond survival. Nokomis approached him after the healer finished tending his wounds. She placed a small hand on his arm, a gesture of appreciation and respect. "I will never forget what you did for me," she said softly. "You risked yourself when no one else would. That is not forgotten." Ethan looked at her, feeling a quiet pride and satisfaction. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I did what was right, that is enough." Yet he knew that her words were more than thanks. They were recognition of shared courage, of trust, and of the bond that had formed between them in the desert. The following days brought recovery and reflection. Ethan regained strength, and Nokomis slowly returned to her usual energy and confidence. Together, they shared stories, laughed quietly, and spoke of the challenges they had faced. The settlement became a temporary haven, a place where they could rest and prepare for whatever lay ahead. Yet the lessons of the desert remained with them. The understanding that courage was not measured by recognition, but by choices made in the face of fear and danger. Ethan knew that their paths would eventually diverge. Nokomis would return to her people, and he would continue his life as a frontiersman. Yet the bond they had formed could not be undone by distance or circumstance. It was a bond forged in courage, sacrifice, and moral certainty, a connection that would endure in memory and spirit. Before leaving, Nokomis spoke quietly to Ethan. "You showed me that courage is not only strength, but heart. I will carry that with me always." Ethan smiled, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "And you showed me that trust and hope can survive even in the harshest places. Never forget that." As Ethan departed the settlement, he felt a quiet satisfaction. His body was healing, his mind was clear, and his spirit was strengthened by the choices he had made. The desert had tested him, challenged him, and demanded everything he could give. Yet in every wound, every pain, and every moment of fear, he had acted with honor, not for glory, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Nokomis watched him leave, her heart filled with gratitude and respect. She carried the story of his bravery with her, sharing it with her people and remembering the man who had risked everything to save a life. Ethan's actions had left a lasting impact, not only on her life but on her understanding of courage, trust, and the power of moral strength. The desert stretched endlessly beyond the settlement, harsh and beautiful, full of challenges yet alive with possibility. Ethan walked forward, his step steady and resolute. He had faced fear, risk, and danger, and he had emerged with honor intact. He had acted with courage when it mattered most, and in doing so had created a story that would endure. A story of selflessness, bravery, and the unwavering choice to protect another life without hesitation. Even as the sun set over the distant mountains, casting golden light across the plains, Ethan knew one thing with certainty. Not for a single moment had he regretted his choices. He had taken the arrows, endured the pain, and faced the danger. And in the process, he had discovered the true meaning of courage, the kind that is quiet, unwavering, and defined not by recognition, but by the steadfast choice to do what is right. The desert whispered around him, carrying with it the stories of those who had come before. the echoes of lives lived with courage and honor. Ethan's story was now a part of that timeless land, a testament to the power of selflessness, trust, and moral strength. And as he disappeared into the horizon, strong, scarred, and unbroken, the world knew that true heroism is measured not by fame but by the courage to act when it is needed most.